Alright guys, we are done with those implementation steps and our basic API version is actually finalized, and now our front-end application is using our basic API service. Let me quickly go over those steps and quickly summarize what we did here. First, we created Python virtual environment with help of PAP env. PAP env was installed globally on our computers, and using it you could very easily create virtual environments for your projects. Virtual environment contains all necessary modules that you install in your particular application, and PAP env creates such files as PAP file and PAP file.log. We installed Python Flask, and with Python Flask you could very easily create a web server. And just with 7 lines of code, we created basic Flask web server. After that, we created new image API endpoint and configured requests to Unsplash API using Unsplash key. And now it is done in our Flask application. Also, we installed such application as Postman, and Postman is a feature-rich application that allows you to test your API, and for that you don't need any web browser. And you could send different types of requests – get, post, delete, and so on, and observe which headers are sent back in response, and also, if you need, you could modify request headers. After that, we changed our front-end application, and now it uses Flask API instead of Unsplash API. Also, after this change, we noticed that the web browser refused to accept a response from the server due to absence of special header in the response. And this header is called access control allow origin. And in order to enable insertion of such header in the response from the Flask server, we installed additional module called Flask CORS, and we enabled CORS for all origins in our Flask application. And after this step, web browser correctly processes all responses from our Flask web server. And finally, we installed and enabled PyLint linter and black formatter for Python. By the way, this step was absent in initial implementation plan, but here I decided to add it because that's what we just did at the end of this section. And now, upon save of the Python files, PyLint and black do their job and automatically format the files, similarly as it is done in JavaScript files with help of ESLint and Prettier. Alright guys, that's how our front-end application looks right now. There are no visual changes here, but now in order to get all those images, it makes requests to the Flask API service, not to Unsplash API. And that's how our Flask application looks right now. We utilize such modules as flask.env, Flask CORS. Here we load environment variables from the env.local file. Here we defined several constants like Unsplash URL, Unsplash key, and debug. By the way, we also enabled debug mode, and with help of debug mode, we don't need to reload the application manually each time when we change the file. It will be reloaded automatically, and it is very useful during development process. Also here we enabled CORS for our Flask application, and here we created single endpoint new image. Here is view function that is called each time when such endpoint is requested by the client, and here we perform such actions as retrieval of the query parameter from the client request. Afterwards we create headers and params dictionaries and send request using request get. Actually, you might notice that the headers dictionary is now on the single line, and before it was split into multiple lines, and that's what actually black and PyLint did for me, but I am pretty fine with that. Here in this get function call, we pass such named arguments as URL, headers, and params. And when we get response from the server, we get JSON out of the body of that response and return data back. And this data will be actually dictionary, and it will be converted to JSON object in the response to the client. That's how our Flask server looks right now, and in the app.js file in the React application we adjusted only URL here in the fetch request, and now we query new image endpoint, and we send actually get request with such query parameter as query without any authentication. And basically now anyone could query this endpoint at our Flask server. Alright guys, that's it for this section, and in the next section we will continue with development of the images gallery project, and we will be focused now more on development than on the creation of the applications themselves. Because now all hard work related to configuration of the PI-lint, ES-lint, prettier, black formatters is done, and now we could focus on the development itself. So I'll see you guys in the next sections.